a storytelling workshop last winter that culminated in a presentation at the Rye, New Hampshire Library, and the course was taught by a woman named Pat Spalding, who teaches and actually does a lot of storytelling work with the Portsmouth, New Hampshire Community Radio. So this is my presentation. It's called My Voice, Lost and Found. When I was about 17 or 18, I was the assistant manager at a convenience store. And so one night I was working in my role. I felt kind of proud of that role, that I was reliable and wanted to do a good job. Well, anyway, one particular night a car drove into the front window, crashed right in. Nobody was hurt, so that's not part of the story. But the glass was shattered and there were soda pop bottles popping all over the place. And so I called the police and they were on their way, and I promptly called the manager to let the manager know what happened. And he told me that I should call the glass company and where I would find that number. And I found the number and called this company. Now, I was on the phone with them explaining the damage and describing it, and I don't remember the exact details, but some of it was just the guy from the glass company asking me a question, and I would say, oh, okay, well, it's 2 windows, and they're about 3 feet by 2 feet or whatever. And some of the questions I was just giving verbatim information from what the police officer that had arrived was telling me, and I would tell the guy on the phone. So it was sort of a conversation that went like, the glass company says, well, how many windows? And I look to the cop and he'd say, well, there's 2 that are completely broken and 1 that's cracked. And so I'd get back on the phone and I said, well, there's 2 that are completely broken and 1 that's cracked. And the glass guy would say, well, how thick is the glass? And I'd look to the cop and say, how thick is the glass? And he'd say, oh, it's between an 1/8 and a 1/4 of an inch. I'd be on the phone, well, it's between an 1/8 and a 1/4 of an inch. Well, all of a sudden the guy at the glass company said, can I talk to a man? And in that moment, I knew something was wrong. It was a stunning moment that I can feel just sharing it with you now, but I couldn't tell you what exactly was wrong with it. It was a message that I think confirmed other messages that I was getting in my life as a young woman in the early 70s in the United States. But you know, I wasn't a passive person. And so let me take you down the road a couple of years later when I was visiting my sister-in-law and my nieces and nephew. I was sitting in her kitchen. I used to have a little red Le Car. I actually changed it to Le Car. But anyway, aside from that, my sister-in-law, who used to call me Bethel, was looking out the window and she said, Bethel, somebody's stealing your car. And I did not hesitate 1 minute. I raced out the door. My little car was backing out of the driveway, and they lived on sort of a hill, and it was a standard transmission. So at that moment when the person that was driving my car away had to stop and shift from reverse to forward, I jumped in the passenger seat. I pulled up the emergency brake, which was in the middle of the console, and I motioned with my thumb for him to get out. And he did, and I got in the driver's seat, and I think I went after him for maybe 1/10 of a mile or something, just to show my strength or something like that. And admittedly, jumping in the car as somebody that was stealing my car might not have been the smart thing to do, but I share that to just say that my immediate response was to take action. Now, let's go fast forward to my mid-20s when I was late 20s, okay? I was a newly graduated nurse, and I was working in a community hospital. Now, I had a bachelor's in biochemistry before I went to nursing school. So I have to tell you that when I went to nursing school, I was really surprised at how rigorous the program was. I think back then I thought, oh, you know what, being a nurse isn't that challenging. I've had a degree in biochemistry. This is going to be a breeze. Well, it wasn't. It was very challenging. Academically, it was one of the most rigorous programs I had taken. And I was very excited about being a nurse. So here I was, a new nurse in this little community hospital. I think this was in my first couple of weeks of my job. And I was in a patient's room with my white uniform. I didn't have to wear the student tunic anymore. I was a registered nurse and I had my license. And so this particular person had an IV in her arm. And that IV didn't seem to be flowing. It should be flowing in the whatever, if it was normal saline or an antibiotic, perhaps it was going into her arm, was not going in satisfactorily. So I was doing some things that nurses do. I was examining the site. I was moving her wrist around a little bit to see sometimes the position of somebody's wrist can make a difference in the flow. When all of a sudden I heard this big booming voice from the door saying, "What the hell are you doing?" And it was a surgeon, and it brought me back, at least in retrospect, to what that feeling was when I was in the convenience store talking to the guy in the glass company. I think I was shocked that this perception that I had, that I was a respected part of a team in healthcare, or respected part of the management team at the convenience store, that it was a mixed message. Maybe I wasn't. And I still remember that physician's name, but I'm not going to share it. And anyway, that same summer after I had graduated in the same hospital, a few weeks later, I remember a situation where a patient was, he had a very serious diagnosis of cancer, and I knew that. And his surgeon, a different surgeon, had just been in the patient's room, and I had found out that there was some new medication orders, and he was on an IV of morphine. And so I went in. Again, I don't remember the exact details why I went in, but the patient was probably about my height and was standing up. He had the Johnny on, he had an IV pole, and his eyes were kind of crazy. His pupils were constricted, and he started walking towards me, and I backed up, but it was a pretty small room, and after a step or two, my back was up against the wall, and this patient, as sick as he was able to reach up with both his hands and put them around my neck. And I'm a pretty strong, physically strong woman, and I simply took his hands and wrists away and gently pushed him back and sideways got out of the room. And then I shared the experience with his surgeon, and the surgeon explained to me that the patient was withdrawing from morphine. And so at that point in time, I just said, oh, okay. It was like the piece of information that explained the patient's behavior was the important piece. And it wasn't until actually almost 25 years later, when I was working on a textbook, Successful Nurse Communication, that will be published in September of 2015, when I was writing about workplace violence, and I remembered that situation, and I thought, oh my God, it didn't matter. It didn't matter that I had been assaulted by this patient. The surgeon didn't care. There was no effort to, are you okay? And in fact, I participated in that reality. I just went about my business. It didn't matter that that had happened. And in retrospect, I think that's kind of a sad statement. And so then let's go fast forward a few years until the summer of 2014, where I'm in the midst of some of my consulting work and my writing again on this textbook that I'm very excited about. But I was also working per diem in a nursing home. And I used to work the evening shift for locked units with folks with dementia. And I have a lot of joyful memories of that work. It's very different and unique in its own way. But there was one day when I called in sick to my shift. It was a 3 to 11 shift. And when I called the scheduler to report that I wasn't coming in, he started yelling at me. And what's your problem? And why aren't you going to be here? And what are your symptoms? And I said, I'm sick. And he kept pushing me. What's your problem? Why aren't you coming? And so I just gave him some symptoms and hung up. I had diarrhea and a fever or whatever. But you know, that night, and maybe the next night when I started to feel a little bit better and realized just how wrong that was. Now, of course, this is 25 years later where I've had life experiences and I have learned about my own assertiveness. I teach assertiveness, and to me that means I also have to practice it. So when I was feeling better in a couple of days, I resolved to have a conversation with this scheduler about that incident. And so I called him and I said, you know, I want to talk with you about when I called in sick the other day. And he was, well, okay, what's on your mind? And I said, you know, you yelled at me very inappropriately, and I don't want you to ever talk to me like that again. And he said, oh, I talk with everybody like that. And I said, it's not okay. It's not okay. And at that point, I guess, at least for that moment in that situation, I have found my voice.